Here's another excerpt of the conversation I had with Daniel Huff. In this one, we chat about how macro, micro, macro can be applied to teaching notes in a choral rehearsal. Dan, can you explain to us the basic process of just teaching the notes? In a previous video you mentioned we'll go ahead and teach the sopranos and then layer that with the bass line. Well, how do we actually teach them the notes?
Well, this gets partly back to the vocalism problem, but whenever I'm going to introduce a piece, I sage that. I try and teach some of that in advance through the vocalizing, through the warm-ups that I use in the ensemble itself. So for instance, if I know I'm going to teach a particular piece of music and I know it's got a particular figure or a particular technical demand, I try and pre-teach that in the vocalizing so they have some sense of it. And then when I get to introducing that, whatever it is, I link what they already know to that little piece where I'm going to rehearse.
Can you give us an example of what?
Sure. For instance, if I plan to rehearse something in a Dorian mode, for instance, then I'm going to vocalize in a Dorian. I'm going to vocalize in Dorian, some sort of transposed key, so that they hear the difference in the harmonies associated with that scale. And then, since most polyphony is primarily melodically conceived, so it's very much scalar in nature, then they're used to working with that. So as long as I identify their beginning pitch and their ending pitch, they've already got a physical aural link between how it feels to produce a tone and what that tone should sound like coming through their voice part. So I've already pre-taught them a sort of a general association with where the part is going to lie and what it's going to sound like.
What would an example be for, say, as you mentioned before, it's kind of ordinary homophonic music that's not necessarily melodically constructed?
If I were going to do something like that, then I would probably finish my vocalizing with a set of chords in a roughly parallel spacing, so that a common spacing for a choir, thinking in terms of C major, for instance, would be a C in the bass, a G in the tenor, an E in the alto, and a C in the soprano.
Kind of the overtone series almost.
Yes, right, exactly, is the overtone series. And particularly composers who would write using that harmonic vernacular, that's going to be a very typical spacing of those parts. And as long as you have a rough working familiarity with where those notes are and how they start, then the people have an idea how to locate it. Now after that, when it comes down to the actual specific pitches for the specific part that's written, I'm real big on imitation. I think the easiest way to teach, to compound the teaching process or to accelerate the teaching process, is to illustrate as closely as possible the end product that you want them to have. So remember, I'm going to start this at tempo, more or less in key and on time. It's going to all be essentially the way it's performed. And the best way I know to do that is to be able to show them directly. Now there's an obvious workability problem, because clearly I have problems singing in the soprano and the alto range. Certainly not, I wouldn't want them to imitate that sound specifically, but I can teach them to imitate that sound stylistically. And so even if I teach, for instance, the top line, if I sing it an octave lower, which I can control in my voice for most soprano notes, then I'm going to be able to give them a clear idea not only of what the thing sounds like in a fairly precise way, particularly if I involve them in the process. So if I tell them I'm going to sing it one more time, you snap on all the dotted notes and all the tied notes and every place where there's a half note or every place where I should have held or whatever, then they're hearing both the style and the phrase shape at the same time they're hearing the pitches, and then it's their shot. Now after that, there are some things that are just easiest to, for instance, if it's a question of tuning. For instance, once we get this thing layered up and the parts are there but not necessarily in tune, then I'm going to reference them to a piano. And then we're going to begin thinking in textures as opposed to individual lines.
Do we worry about temperament in terms of piano being equal and us striving for something more pure?
Yeah, we do worry about temperament, but to be honest, if the tone is produced well, that is, the vowels are produced well, so that there's a lot of acoustic integrity and similarity in the choir between the various vowel formants, and if they're singing energized and resonated, then there are so many variables in the pitch that I don't generally consider whether or not the temperament, I mean, generally that's the least of my worries. That's most true when you got highly chromatic or highly evolved. For instance, if you're doing Schoenberg, pre-serialist Schoenberg, like Frieda auf Erden or something that complicated, then the chromatic shifts are so many and so varied that intonation becomes a serious problem because of the issue of temperament. But in most other music, particularly music for a more beginning choir, in terms of my level of concerns,
there's other things you need to worry
well
about.
Down the stack.
Right. So you'll reference the piano at that point. Will you reference it for melodic issues? It seems like I've seen before a group that uses a piano. Can you please double the
Yes,
altos,
yes.
and then you take the piano away, or can
Yes.
we just hear soprano basses, piano double that?
Yes.
Is that a reasonable process, or
Totally reasonable process. I think the problem with playing the piano is if I'm the only person there, if I don't have a full-time accompanist, then I have to concentrate on playing the piano. And unless you're extremely adept at playing the piano, then what you end up doing is paying attention to what you're doing as opposed to paying attention to what they're doing, and that's a fatal flaw. If your hired accompanist doesn't understand that you want them out more than you want them in, so that the doubling is purely a matter of exigency, not a religious practice. It's not canonical. We're not going to do this just because it's morally correct. We're doing it because it's only practically necessary. Then they can double too loud, or they can whatever, and you teach the people the opposite of what you want them to know, which is how to become independent singing musicians in their own right. So if you would watch what I actually do, you'd see me start them and run in 3 or 4 notes and bail in 3 or 4 measures later where I anticipate a difficult leap or a particularly difficult rhythm, and I may even do it well in advance. So if we're functioning in a certain key and I know that a certain note is coming and I can play it as a common tone, I just play it well in advance. The other thing I think is wise to do, if you're doubling a part, double it not in the octave that it sings. So if you're doubling the altos and they perennially flat, not that altos ever flat, but if they did, then you'd play it in the soprano octave so that they hear the pitches relative to each other and the notes, but they
so
don't.
It pops out of the texture, otherwise it gets lost.
Otherwise it becomes part of the texture and they just begin to accept it. The real reason why I layer so much is because, in my view, the problem with ordinary traditional approaches to literacy is that people learn to sing their part as though it were dots being connected on the page. So they sing it in a linear fashion without realizing that they have to insert it into the texture in time and harmonic place. And that's a whole other problem. So the reason I texture so much, and the reason why I say that I refer to the piano for harmonic texture from time to time, is that I want them to see it as a sort of a correcting context to the fact that the dot to dot to dot effect, where you can successively sharp every single pitch, and individually they don't sound hugely wrong.
But vertically they do.
But vertically they're massively wrong.
And what you're mentioning in terms of the accompanist, over time you can develop a good rapport with the accompanist where they kind of know exactly what you want and can anticipate, oh yeah, they're going to want me to drop out, and oh yeah, that G sharp is problematic, and they can pop in. But that takes time, of course.
Yes, you prize those people.
Yeah, right.
They're worth their weight in gold.
Yeah, great.